Where did you go after Warsaw?
I left the next morning and went to see my friend Tito. I had a most interesting talk with him. He'd been one of the non-aligned nations, 17 I think there were, if I'm not sure the exact figure, that had urged there be a peaceful settlement. He said that, I asked him to use his influence, and he said that he had some influence perhaps in Moscow, which he would use, but in the Chinese, they looked upon him as his worst enemy. And he said, did you realize that last week they called me a revisionist bandit? And I said, well, that's nothing. They call us imperialist bandits all the time. Oh, but you don't understand that a revisionist is far worse a character than an imperialist. Tito had a certain sense of humor. But in seriousness, he did send word to Moscow, but he couldn't do anything. But he said, well, you ought to see Nasser. You know, Nasser was his good friend as one of the non-aligned. And I wanted to get to, I heard that there was a Russian group going to Hanoi, and I wanted to get word to the Russians that were meeting in Tashkent, and I wanted to get word that to my friend Kosygin that he should tell them to use their influence. So I went to New Delhi next, and I saw Shastri, who was about to go, and he agreed to talk to them. And I saw General Ayub, President Ayub Khan, President of Pakistan, and he also agreed. So both of them were on their way to Tashkent. And they certainly talked to the Russians about this. And then I stopped to see the Shah because I knew he'd be insulted if I didn't see him. I've known him for so long. And then went on to Nasser. I had a very interesting talk with Nasser. He said that the Chinese were very difficult. They were very much for the war and didn't want it interrupted, whereas the Russians wanted to stop it. It confirmed, again, what I told you. He was well informed about it. He said that he would take up the subject with both the Chinese and the Russians. He thought he'd do the Chinese first because they were the most difficult. I got quite a different impression of Nasser. He was a very courteous. I spent the evening at his home. He was very courteous and made a lot of sense. There was nothing dramatic about it. He talked about the situation in a very intelligent way. And then I went on. It seemed that I should. I stopped at Thailand, and I went to Vientiane, Laos, because I was in that area, but I went particularly to Japan. I saw Soho, who was the prime minister, and they were very anxious to see the war stop. I went to see my friend Menzies in Australia, and he was for winning the war. He thought that Vietnam was just as important to Britain as Berlin was. He was very vigorous in wanting to continue it, but they had some soldiers there, you know, and they were involved. And then General Dean, not General Dean, but Dean Rusk wanted me to join him in India and proceed together. He was coming out that way. And so I went and joined him, and we went on to the Philippines and on home. It was a fascinating trip, and I got to know what different people thought about this all over the world. But the biggest impression that I had from all of them was that, not all of them, but from the overwhelming majority of those that knew, was that the Chinese wanted to keep that war going. And the South Vietnamese were influenced by them, whereas the Russians wanted to see the war stop.
Sorry, would you do that over again. The Chinese wanted to keep it going, and the North Vietnamese, not this.
The North Vietnamese.
Yeah, you said South Vietnamese.
What did I say? No, one of the North
Just
Vietnamese.
take it from the beginning, would you?
The
Overwhelming impression.
the Chinese wanted to have the North Vietnamese to continue the war. They wanted the fighting to go on, and the Russians wanted to see it stop. It was obvious at that time that the Russians were trying to expand their influence in the area, and they thought it could be better done with a peaceful situation than with a war going on.
Do you think that President Johnson understood the kinds of moves that were necessary to reach a settlement? Do you think he really wanted a settlement, or were your searches for settlement kind of a way of his placating his own doves?
I think that he had come to a point where he was very much concerned about the outcome. Things were not going as well as he'd hoped. And I think he did want to have, he wanted to do two things. He wanted to avoid all criticism that he was not making a real effort to have a settlement. And he knew to do that he had to be sincere in trying to get a settlement, because he knew that he could not play a phony game and get away with it. But aside from that, I think that he wanted a settlement. He hadn't really thought through what kind of a settlement he could get. But at that time, he was very anxious to have the war reduced, and negotiations started. And I think he thought his negotiating ability was pretty good, and the strength of the United States was pretty good. I think he thought he probably could get a pretty good settlement. And there was a lot of rumors, as I've told you, from different sources. I told you that from Algeria that they were ready to, the North Vietnamese were ready to wait for 5 or 10 years before there was any question of unification. So there were rumors in the air that made it look as if a settlement might be possible. That would be what Johnson would call an honorable settlement. I never spoke of it being an honorable settlement. I always spoke of it as being a responsible settlement.
What role did Henry Kissinger play in the search for settlement?
Well, Henry Kissinger played a very important role in trying to get negotiations going. He had met a certain Frenchman. These names escape me. There was a, I don't know if I can really find them or not, but there was a Frenchman who we met at one of these.
Markovitch. Why don't you start with that?
Markovitch.
Well, let's start it from the beginning. It was Obrak and Markovitch, wasn't it? No, Markovitch?
What were the two names?
Markovitch introduced him to Obrak.
Okay, let's start it again.
What were the two names?
Markovitch and Obrak. A-U-B-R-A-C.
Markovitch. And what was the other name?
Obrak.
What?
A-U-B-R-A-C.
Obrak. Obrak was the communist friend of them.
That's right. Obrak was the World Health Day.
Yeah.
Henry Kissinger played a very important role, and I was very much impressed with what he did. He had met a Frenchman by the name of Markovitch at one of these pugwash conferences where the eggheads get together and try to settle the problems of the world. And Markovitch told him that he knew a man called Obrak, who was a great and close friend of Ho Chi Minh. And he talked to McNamara first, and then McNamara sent him over to see me. And he went back and talked to them. Chet Cooper was my assistant, went on one of the trips, and he had some very interesting talks. Albrecht went once to Hanoi and reported that he hadn't made any real progress, but reported that if we would stop the bombing, that he thought he could make some progress. And we talked it over and gave him some encouragement. And then he tried to go back a second time, and Ho Chi Minh would not let him in unless there was an agreement that bombing would stop. So it ended in nothing accomplished. But I was very much impressed with, the first time I'd met Mr. Kissinger, I was very much impressed with the way he handled the negotiations and what he did about it. And I think Mr. Cooper, my assistant, felt the same way about it.
Did President Johnson take Kissinger seriously? Was he aware of his activities?
I don't know. I didn't talk to President Johnson. I talked to McNamara. He took it very seriously. Of course, he'd known Kissinger at Harvard.
What was Operation Marigold?
Marigold was an operation that was started in Vietnam by the ambassador there, De Lande. De Lande was his name. He was the dean of the diplomatic corps, and he talked to Lodge about it. And he thought that he had a friend whose name, Chet, do you remember?
Lewandowski.
What?
Lewandowski. L-E-W-A-N.
Lewandowski.
Yeah, who was Polish head of ISIS.
Or you better start it over again.
Lewandowski knew them, and he felt they could achieve something real. This operation was called Marigold, and they made some progress. But unfortunately, when Lewandowski got to Hanoi, we bombed Hanoi, and that really discredited him. It was very unfortunate. The orders had been given, or instructions had been given, or authorization had been given, that they could bomb, when the weather was right, the electric plant there. No one remembered that. Weather had been bad for a couple of weeks, and suddenly this bombing occurred without anyone knowing that it was going to happen. When I say anything, nobody knowing, the President or McNamara or Dean Rusk. And this, unfortunately, Marigold, I thought, was ended because of this bombing that took place, unfortunately, at the time they were there. But he had used not only the Rusk statement, but President Johnson had developed, what was it called, Chet, in October he came forward with a program that had a special name.
Phase A, Phase B.
What?
Phase A, Phase B.
And then the other thing, and the other
then
one.
They gave Lewandowski some.
No, but what was the name of that position that he took? It was always called his position that he took in
San Antonio.
San Antonio, formerly.
Let's go back and I'll
So
ask
that
you.
we,
Let me just ask you a question so you can pick it up again. What kind of instructions was Lewandowski given?
well, I don't recall the details of it, but I know that he was given the current position. One was Phase A and Phase B. Phase A was that they'd stop all the bombing, and there'd be an interval of time, and it wouldn't appear as if there was anything to do about it, and then we'd have Phase B. We'd agree in advance what Phase B would be, the kind of negotiations which we'd enter into. So there'd be an agreement that the negotiations would start. We thought they would accept that. It was also given the San Antonio formula, which President Johnson had developed, and the various points that were in the Secretary of Rusk's positions. And these were all developed, and interest was shown, but they never got any definite word. And the North Vietnamese called off negotiations when our bombs came in and bombed Hanoi the very day that this man was there. So that stopped, and it was ended because of the bombing.
Was that when we had bombing in the middle of attempts to find settlements? Was that, in your opinion?
Hold it to the airplane.
Could you talk a little louder?
Yeah.
I can't hear.
When we
Just wait.
ready?
Okay.
When we had bombings in the middle of efforts to find a settlement, do you think that that bombing was simply a mistake, or was it a question of some kind of uncoordination in Washington, or was there a deliberate effort on the part, you think, maybe of the Pentagon to sabotage peace efforts?
No, this particular Marigold, I know, was just an accident which occurred. They had been authorized to hit this target a couple of weeks before. There'd been a couple of weeks of bad weather. I'm sure the Pentagon forgot that they had this authority, and it just happened to come off. It was an accident, which was too bad. As a matter of fact, we felt so badly about the president and McNamara felt so badly about it that they put a zone of no bombing within a radius of 10 miles. And I hoped that would get the negotiations back on the track. It was an indication of sincerity on the part of President Johnson's part, and certainly on the part of McNamara, who was very keen to have negotiations. But that didn't do any good. No, there was no sabotage, and there was no attempt to use bombing. There was no stupid attempt to think that by bombing we could scare them into it. The thing that unfortunately, this bombing made them more and more determined, but it was bad luck and bad bureaucracy. They didn't have a computer on it, unfortunately, in those days.
During the Nixon administration, did you ever discuss the Vietnam situation with the Russians?
Never.
And so there was no role that you played at all during the Nixon administration?
I did see Mr. Nixon, Mr. Kissinger. I came back in December after the election because I was chairman of the President's Human Rights Commission, which was celebrating the anniversary of the United Nations Declaration. And I saw Kissinger, and he took me to see Nixon, and that was the only time I ever saw Nixon. I did see Kissinger several times. He said he wanted to keep in touch with me and get my advice, but he didn't take my advice, and so I stopped seeing him. But I thought the general idea that we should come to an agreement on the settlement when we had 500,000 troops, not when we had no one. I was very unhappy that President Nixon kept the war going for 3 years. 40% of all the people that were killed, American soldiers were killed during that period, and we were in worse position, I thought, to make a deal at the end of our withdrawal than at the beginning.
Was that your advice to Kissinger? What kind of advice did you give him?
Well, I told him that I thought we ought to come to an agreement right away. And I don't know who was responsible, and I'm not blaming anybody because I don't know the slightest idea whose idea it was to keep the war going. But my impression had been that Kissinger wanted to stop the war himself, but he evidently didn't have a strong enough voice or change his mind. I don't know.
Since we're going to have one show on Cambodia, I'd like to get your opinion of Sihanouk. When did you meet him, and what did you think of his policy?
Well, I went to see Sihanouk because he was a member of the Geneva Conference, and I first met him in Laos when he came to see. I think there was a wedding or a coronation, a wedding, I think, of one of the family, and then I saw him. I went to Cambodia several times in my trips through that area. I thought and he was always very courteous. He did the honor once of asking me or Mansfield to mediate something because he had confidence. I haven't struck a good relationship with him. I found him really, for the area, a very good ruler. He was a bit of a playboy. He liked music and he liked to have a good time. But back of it all, the people loved him, and they would have elected him over and over again. And he was a real neutral. I remember he used to be rather say disagreeable things about us for a while, and then he'd say a little bit less disagreeable things about Russia because Russia was a little closer, and then he'd say something not quite flattering to the Chinese. He kept revolving, and then he would say, he would keep us all quiet, reasonably quiet. But I thought he was an ideal neutral, and I thought it was a great tragedy that he was dropped out of the situation and the military took over. It was not a useful thing for the welfare of the area.
What was your opinion of the Nixon administration's invasion of Cambodia?
I'm not, of course, utterly opposed to the expanding of the war. We had, I remember somebody told me that compared it to the Germans invading Belgium, invading a neutral country. I don't know whether that was fair or not, but I didn't get that idea, but I was very much surprised that we should have invaded Cambodia. This idea that you could knock out a few North Vietnamese by invading a neutral country I thought was a mistake.
Governor, I have one last question. When you look back on Vietnam, what kind of lessons do you think we have learned or we should have learned from Vietnam?
One is not to be so quick to use American troops. The Truman
Wait a second. Can I start you again? I
Yes.
started saying the lessons of Vietnam.
Well, these lessons of the Vietnamese War are rather hard to define. I think, number one, it really had nothing to do with the Truman Doctrine. Truman Doctrine provided that we should help people that were under communist attack who wanted our help, and the legislation particularly specifically provided that we should never send troops. We could give military, economic and military aid and send advisors, but no further. And therefore it's very unfair to Truman Doctrine to compare Vietnam to it, and we shouldn't be afraid to do that. I think with the communists in the world trying their best to support liberation movements, unless somebody, they pour money and they pour men and they pour all sorts of ways to undermine the established government. And I think that we ought to take an interest where people really want us to help them, but we should not send troops. And I think that was one of the major lessons that we learned. The other is, of course, that you can't fight guerrilla warfare and with regular army, the local people have to deal with guerrilla warfare. It's interesting that as a result of the advice and assistance we gave to Latin America, Castro wasn't able to penetrate a single country in Latin America. Most of it was overt. We trained the armies to deal with guerrilla warfare. We had a school to train the police. And incidentally, one of the things we tried to indoctrinate on them was that torture was the surest way to build up martyrs, and was a great mistake aside from its inhumanity. And that was a useful institution. There are other ways that we help the Latin Americans do it. And we shouldn't be afraid to do it. If we bow out, it'll leave the Russians an open field to help liberation movements wherever they want to. And countries can be taken over by a small group of people that are a minority if they get the outside help to do so. So I think one of the lessons of Vietnam is that we shouldn't be afraid to do what's right and proper in terms of helping the people in the world that are trying to defend themselves against communist aggression. But we shouldn't put American troops in.
I think that's it.
You think there's anything I left out?
Yes, there's one problem, and that is on the Marigold discussion. The last few sentences that you had on Marigold, you mentioned the San Antonio formula. But that was a year later.